Hello, and welcome to Unitary Designation. Today I wanted to talk about something that has been on my mind for quite a while, and something that when I try to search for videos or reflections on this it doesn't seem to be an area that has a lot of attention, so I figured I'd give it some, since I happen to have a background in philosophy and I happen to be more than casually interested in comedy. I figured I'd analyze this. So the link between comedy and philosophy. Now, let's start with this Norm Macdonald clip here. That's what got me first thinking about it. This is from Norm Macdonald's new special called Nothing Special, which is on Netflix. And this is a short clip. See, we're just gonna
expect you to know things.
okay.
And you're a comedian, they expect you to know things nowadays. You know what I mean? It didn't used to be like that. Like during the Vietnam War, they wouldn't go, wonder what Red Skeleton thinks on this. But nowadays, like I've heard, they go, a comedian is the modern day philosopher, you know? Which, first of all, it always makes me feel sad for the actual modern day philosophers who exist, you know?
So that's that was a good. I think that's a good clip, and it's a good point. When I first heard the term that comedians were the modern day philosophers, it was in relation to this clip, which is Louis C.K. hates cell phone on Conan. It got 14 million views, and I remember I read about it in an article, I heard about it when I was studying philosophy. Someone at the academy used this as an example of like some form of wisdom insight making its way into the population through comedy. And I don't know if it's just because he hit this this level of attention, 14 million views, or if it's because the point he made was good, but it was the first time I heard that link, philosophers as comedians. His point is long, and we're not going to go into it here, but it's essentially that everyone's just like lost on their phones, and he won't let his kids use the phones because he wants them to grow up as people. But that's a whole other topic. I wanted to reflect on what is the... Okay, so why would someone make that connection? And notice, I'm not making it. I'm just observing that it's being made and reflecting on it. Why would someone make the connection that philosophers and comedians are the same, or they're similar? Well, I think Norm Macdonald made a good point in his clip. That he feels bad for modern day philosophers who actually try to research and publish and be heard. And there's something about comedy that is... its aim is to be funny, but the mechanism of action through which it is funny is the spoken word, the oratory act of speaking truth. Something can't make you laugh unless you recognize it as not true in the metaphysical sense, but as inherently funny. Like, you can't fake laughter. You can fake the gestures of like laughter, but when something makes you laugh as a participant in comedy, you can't fake that. It's like sneezing, or it's an authentic response. And I think that's part of why people love comedy so much. It gets to something authentic in you. And comics on stage work tirelessly to generate those kind of authentic responses. They write down jokes, they try out the jokes in small clubs, people respond to some things, not to other things. They hone their bits, into premises and deliveries and pauses and punchlines, and it's all a very technical format, all meant to elicit this response. They're trying to elicit this response. It's an industry of eliciting that authentic laugh response. And they often have to make points that you relate to. And some comedians, more so than others, like George Carlin, or I'm going to reveal my profound ignorance of the depth of stand-up with Bill Hicks, and there seems to be some form of overlap between more popular comedians and more popularizers of philosophy. Like comedy and philosophy have this sort of, they often comedy often dips into philosophy, and especially when people make profound in comments on the structure of the West, race issues, class issues. Comedians try to comment on the operating system of our society. Then that's one aspect of what philosophers do too. Philosophers tend to attempt to describe the world as they see it and the way we're running things in a way that is meant to facilitate change in an improved direction. For Plato and Aristotle, this was the search of eudaimonia, or the pursuit in the pursuit of the good life. And for Plato, it had more to do with the construction of an ideal state. But they both seem to aim at using philosophy as a mechanism of directing the continuation of the state, or the continuation of the individually lived life. They both used philosophy as tools for life. And comedy, because it hits at something that is authentically recognizable, like you can make fun of yourself, but you have to realize, I'm making that mistake, and then laugh as a authentic response. It serves to facilitate that. Comedy is a form of insight. It's a form of insight because it gets at something that a congruence, a cognitive dissonance that you hold within yourself, or about how the world works. Like Bill Burr making a joke about some form of societal contradiction is funny to us, to the degree that we find it funny, because we recognize it as a conflict between the way we think things ought to be and the way things currently are. And he presents it as a way that is not reprimandal or finger-wagging, but as humorous. That's why it functions. So that's one of the links between philosophers and comedians. But you'd be remiss if you made if you took those similarities to mean that comedians are philosophers. They're not. Comedy is its own form of value generation, its own form of entertainment, its own form of art, I suppose you can put it. It's about laughter. It's about comedy. Philosophy is not about humor, in a sense. It's about structured, analytical thought and reasons for exploring being as is. But to the degree that philosophy doesn't disseminate into the general population, and this is something I've tried to talk to my philosophy professors about, and something they have been resistant, cautious of. If philosophy doesn't translate down into the general population, then it's not helping people live better lives. And it's also, it stays within the field. And I think one of the more popular philosophies that have arisen in the last century was the philosophy of existentialism. And it's not particularly humorous, but it's appealing. And the question becomes, why is it so appealing when other forms of philosophy is less so? Why is the public appetite for that particular brand of philosophy so high? It could be that it's dumb enough so that people on average can get it. That might be an explanatory model. But it could also be that people respond to something that has an intrinsic relevance to their life. And because in ancient Athens, the philosophers would take to more public arenas and people were more educated in general, and the public discourse often, the linkage between philosophy and politics and ethics weren't necessarily as institutionalized and distinct as they are now. People had access to more philosophy, and the church has taken over much of that responsibility in the West, and with its integration and with our finding grand narratives in politics rather than religion. And I'm not saying we should go back to religion, but we are finding our unifying narratives through political movements instead of religious movements. Seems to be the case. People are turning to any medium that disseminates wisdoms and insights to them. And because comedy has this penetrating ability to bypass the ego structures by making you laugh about yourself, it's ideally suited to disseminate wisdom. So even if the comedians aren't trying to be philosophers, they're not trying to be orators of wisdom or knowledge or insight, they still manage to help people expand themselves past their current limitations, because they laugh at themselves, they realize that that cognitive container is insufficient, and then they strive for like a new picture. It doesn't have to be a better one, though it usually is, because it's more adaptive, since it by the old one was breakable. So as anyone who's read metaphysics or read ethics knows, that's not the same activity as making jokes about sexuality or gender. But because philosophy has been, this is a pro-philosophy stance, I think. Because philosophy has been withheld from the population, they seek it, and one of the ways, not the way, but one of the ways that they get it is from comedy. Now, Norm's point is correct. If back in the day, people didn't ask what some comedian thought about a world event, but they sort of have become that. We're sort of, not we as a culture, but it's often when something like the Will Smith slap happens, or when something like the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial happens, we often wait for comedians to provide their takes. And it's sort of like, because they've practiced the art of saying what they think so long, they have this sort of competence that relates to their ability to put thoughts into speech, and it's easier to wait for their take and then find out to what extent you agree or disagree than it is to make your whole own take. So I think Norm is right here, that nowadays people do seem to hold comics up to the mantle of philosophers, and
modern day philosophy.
It's detrimental, because there are actual philosophers out there who would love to be heard, but they haven't spent the 10, 20, 30 years in comedy clubs practicing their speech. They have practiced their speech in institutions, in the university, and that has its limitations, and it also has its benefits. One of the benefits of having practiced your speech in academia is that you're well versed in dialogue, and you're well versed in rationally defending your position and criticizing other positions and arguing in a structured manner. But that's too time consuming for the average person who has kids, families, parents to take care of, jobs to hold, their own health to look after. They have the time for these 1-hour comedy specials that take years to make, where people can distill social criticisms into points that you can easily relate to because they elicit laughter. And if you laugh, it's not necessarily true, but ipso facto, you agree with it. There seems to be something about the laugh response that makes us go, oh, okay. And I've heard comedians make that observation that when they listen to comedy, this is professional comedians talking about their experience listening to other comedians. It's like they're allowing the comedian to think for them. It's like you go into a sort of mind state where you allow the person to think for you, and to the extent that he makes you laugh, you're like, okay, take the reins, like, you got it, go with the flow. And so that is, in a sense, what philosophy, one of the aspects of what philosophy can do. One of the many, 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 many things that philosophy can do is help you not have to think everything through for yourself. Someone else can teach you better ways to think. Like reading Hume can inform you on ways to think that you didn't have previously. Same thing with comedians in that particular sense. Listening to a comic show you his perspective can inform your own capacity to generate further takes. And you don't necessarily need to repeat the joke, but you now know how to not fall for that particular fallacy again. So, those were some of my thoughts on how comedians are like philosophers. It comes back to this point of free speech. Speech, articulated thought in speech, and it can be free, sure, whatever. That's not the point of this video. There are actual modern day philosophers that might have more to say about how society should be run than Louis C.K. do. But why aren't they heard? Why don't they? If there is a market for their insights, why isn't there some form of market-driven delivery system? And to a certain extent, there are philosophy YouTube channels, though many serious philosophers like School of Life, Why Comedy Matters, though many serious philosophers would scoff at that and say that the pursuit of philosophy is done in text, and it's done in academia, and it's done in journals, and that's it. Once you turn to media, you're not doing philosophy. Fair enough, but they might be losing out on a market. And fair enough. They might say, no, we're doing research, dissemination, whatever, that's not our job. And scientists used to think that for the longest time. It took people like Carl Sagan and Bill Nye the Science Guy and Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking to popularize science, to make us understand why it was important for the population to know it. And you could just as well argue that it's equally or more important for the population to know philosophy, because there's the question of how should I live? What are worth fighting for? What is worth dying for? What are ethics? What are morals? Not what is the world like, but how should I act? It's a big question, and we turn to, in the absence of serious philosophers, we turn to comedians. And in that sense, they are, I'm not saying this as a promotion. But to the extent that we replace philosophy with comedians, they are modern day philosophers. Now, they're not modern day philosophers in the sense that they do the work that philosophy should be doing, but they do tend to fill that hunger or that rare aspiration in the everyday person for a new way of thinking about the world. So, those were just some thoughts. I could go into more depth, and presumably I should, but I don't have much more to add that isn't... I'd have to go into specific philosophical areas, and some philosophical areas are doing great at communicating, and some form of stand-up is just not philosophy adjacent at all. And I don't think you should call comedians modern day philosophers. I don't think that, because philosophy is a serious business with life and death consequences, which we're seeing play out politically on the world stage. Comedy is a form of entertainment. They overlap to a certain extent. The Venn diagram sometimes overlaps, and I just thought it was interesting to see what parts overlap. And so, yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you for watching, and hope you're having a great day.